As tensions between the United States, Israel, and Iran continue to escalate in 2025, the prospect of a direct U.S. military intervention in Iran, involving ground troop deployment, looms as a potential flashpoint. This analysis explores the implications of such a deployment, factoring in the ongoing U.S.-Israel-Iran conflict and the military dynamics that would shape the outcome. The U.S.-Israel-Iran triangle has been a source of regional instability for years, driven by Iran's nuclear ambitions, its support for proxy groups like Hezbollah, and its ballistic missile program. Israel's frequent airstrikes on Iranian-linked targets in Syria and Lebanon, coupled with U.S. sanctions and covert operations, have heightened tensions. Iran's alleged nuclear program brought both United States and Israel in an ongoing conflict with Iran at the start of June 2025. Since then, U.S. President Donald Trump has not ruled out the possibility of deploying troops to Iran. Military disparities and strategic considerations. Iran ranks 14th globally in military strength, a notable position despite decades of sanctions, but it pales in comparison to the United States, the world's preeminent military superpower. The U.S. fields a professional, all-volunteer force of 1.39 million active-duty personnel and 442,000 reservists, backed by a $770 billion defense budget. Iran, with 575,000 active troops and 350,000 reservists, relies heavily on conscription, with mandatory 2-year service for males starting at age 19. Its $5 billion defense budget, supplemented by covert spending, limits modernization. The U.S. population of 335 million dwarfs Iran's 86 million, providing a larger pool for potential mobilization, 147 million versus 48 million. Annually, 4.3 million American teenagers reach military age, compared to Iran's 1.3 million, ensuring greater sustainability in a prolonged conflict. Iran's conscripts, however, receive minimal training, often using Cold War-era equipment, while U.S. forces undergo rigorous, year-round training, including large-scale exercises like RIMPAC. Initial phases of U.S. troop deployment. A U.S. ground invasion would likely follow a devastating air campaign, leveraging the U.S.'s 13,247 aircraft, including 1,957 fighters, like the F-22 and F-35, to neutralize Iran's 543-plane Air Force, which includes aging F-14 Tomcats and MiG-29s. Iran's air defenses, such as the Bavar 373 and S-300 systems, would pose a threat to older aircraft but be vulnerable to U.S. stealth technology and electronic jamming. U.S. Wild Weasel aircraft would target radars and missile sites, dismantling Iran's air defense network, as seen in prior U.S. operations in Iraq and Syria. With air superiority secured, U.S. carrier-based aircraft from its 11 supercarriers and Air Force jets from regional bases, e.g. in Saudi Arabia or Qatar, would strike Iranian command centers, logistics hubs, and troop concentrations. Iran's ballistic missile arsenal, often used against Israel, would target U.S. bases and ships, but robust U.S. and allied defenses, bolstered by Israeli expertise in missile interception, would limit damage. Iran's 19 submarines, mostly midget subs, could disrupt Persian Gulf shipping, but U.S. anti-submarine warfare, enhanced since the 2000s, would neutralize this threat. Ground invasion challenges. Deploying ground troops to Iran would be a logistical nightmare due to its size, larger than several European nations combined, and challenging terrain. Invading through Iraq would involve navigating swamps and the Zagros Mountains, favoring defenders. Turkey, with strained U.S. relations, is unlikely to allow staging, as seen during the 2003 Iraq invasion. An eastern approach via Afghanistan would cross deserts, far from key targets. An amphibious assault, leveraging the U.S. Navy's 9 amphibious carriers and Marine Corps' F-35s, is the most feasible but risky option, given the complexity of such operations. A 2000 study estimated that occupying Iran would require 1.6 million troops, far exceeding U.S. active forces. Conscription or coalition support from allies like Israel or Gulf states would be necessary, especially given shared concerns over Iran's regional influence. Israel, already engaged in countering Iranian proxies, could provide intelligence and air support, but is unlikely to commit ground troops due to its own security priorities. Ground combat dynamics. Once ashore, U.S. forces, equipped with 6,612 advanced M1 Abrams tanks and 45,000 armored vehicles, would overpower Iran's 2,831 tanks, mostly outdated T-72s, and 7,600 armored vehicles. U.S. artillery with 1,498 self-propelled and 1,339 towed pieces employs precision-guided munitions, outmatching Iran's 1,030 self-propelled and 2,108 towed artillery units. Iran's 2,485 MLRS systems could inflict damage on infantry, but U.S. air dominance would render them vulnerable. Iran's strategy would likely shift to asymmetric warfare, using its Revolutionary Guard and proxy networks to conduct guerrilla attacks, similar to tactics in Afghanistan. Iran's attempts to infiltrate agents into the U.S., as seen in reported 2024 plots against American officials, suggest a readiness to employ terrorism. However, U.S. counterinsurgency experience and advanced intelligence would mitigate these threats. Role of the Iranian population. Domestic discontent in Iran, fueled by sanctions and regime oppression, could be a wild card. Many Iranians, particularly younger generations, resent the Tehran government. A U.S. campaign minimizing civilian casualties could rally local support, distinguishing this conflict from Iraq or Afghanistan. However, nationalist backlash or sectarian divides could complicate efforts, especially if Israel's involvement fuels anti-U.S. sentiment. Implications for the U.S.-Israel-Iran conflict. A U.S. ground invasion would escalate the U.S.-Israel-Iran conflict, potentially drawing in regional actors. Israel's focus on neutralizing Iranian proxies could complement U.S. efforts, but Iranian retaliation against Israeli cities via missiles or Hezbollah could strain the alliance. Gulf states, wary of Iran's influence, might provide basing or logistical support, but public opinion could limit their involvement. The global impact would be severe. Iran's disruption of Persian Gulf shipping could spike oil prices, straining economies. The U.S. public, wary of prolonged Middle East wars, might oppose a drawn-out conflict, especially if casualties mount. Iran's regime, facing existential pressure, could double down on asymmetric tactics or seek Chinese and Russian support, though both nations are unlikely to risk direct confrontation with the U.S. Which countries might get involved? Predicting which countries might get involved in a hypothetical U.S. ground invasion of Iran involves assessing geopolitical alignments, regional interests, and the dynamics outlined in recent developments. Countries likely to support the United States and Israel. Saudi Arabia. As a key U.S. ally and a regional rival of Iran, Saudi Arabia would likely provide logistical support, such as basing rights for U.S. forces, as it has in past Middle East conflicts. United Arab Emirates. The UAE, a partner in the Abraham Accords normalizing relations with Israel, shares concerns about Iran's regional ambitions. It could offer air bases or intelligence support, though it would avoid direct combat involvement to protect economic interests and avoid being targeted by Iran. Qatar. Hosting the U.S.'s Al Udeid Air Base, Qatar would likely serve as a staging ground for U.S. operations, as seen in Iran's retaliatory strike on the base in 2025. United Kingdom, France, and Germany. These European allies, part of NATO, have expressed concerns about Iran's nuclear program and engaged in diplomacy with Iran in 2025. They could provide diplomatic backing, intelligence, or limited military support. Countries likely to support Iran. Russia. Russia has historically supported Iran, including through nuclear cooperation and arms sales. In 2025, Russia condemned U.S. strikes on Iran and offered mediation, suggesting it would provide diplomatic and possibly military support. China. China, a major buyer of Iranian oil, has called for de-escalation but condemned U.S. and Israeli actions. It could provide economic support to Iran, such as purchasing oil to offset sanctions or supply dual-use technology. North Korea. North Korea's reported threats to intervene on Iran's behalf suggest potential arms support, as it has supplied weapons to Iran in the past. Pakistan. Posts on X claim Pakistan pledged ballistic missiles to Iran, reflecting its alignment with Iran as a fellow Muslim majority nation. However, Pakistan's involvement would likely be limited to material support to avoid antagonizing the US or India, its regional rival. Houthi forces, Yemen. The Houthis, Iran-backed militants, have already fired missiles at Israel in 2025, viewing US strikes as a declaration of war. They could intensify attacks on US and Israeli targets or disrupt Red Sea shipping, impacting global trade. Hezbollah, Lebanon. Despite being weakened by Israeli strikes, Hezbollah remains Iran's key proxy. It could launch rocket attacks on Israel or target US interests in Lebanon, though its reduced capacity limits its role. Neutral or cautious actors. Turkey. Turkey offered to host US-Iran talks in 2025, indicating a neutral stance. It balances NATO membership with economic ties to Iran, making direct involvement unlikely. Iraq. Iraq, hosting US troops in Iranian-backed militias, faces internal divisions. Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani warned of regional dangers, indicating Iraq's desire to avoid being a battleground. Egypt and Jordan. These US-aligned states pursue diplomacy with Iran to reduce tensions but condemn Israel's actions in Gaza. They would likely avoid direct involvement to focus on domestic stability. India. Despite rumors claiming India might counter Pakistan's support for Iran, India's non-aligned stance and economic ties with the US suggest it would remain neutral, focusing on energy security. Conclusion. A US troop deployment to Iran would leverage overwhelming military advantages but face significant challenges due to Iran's size, terrain, and asymmetric tactics. The US-Israel-Iran conflict would intensify, with Israel's role limited to air and intelligence support. While the US could achieve battlefield dominance, occupying Iran would require unprecedented resources and coalition support. Domestic Iranian unrest could aid US objectives, but the risk of a prolonged, costly conflict remains high, with ripple effects across the Middle East and beyond, even possibly starting a world war.